Jonathan Blake had never been one for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. A mechanical engineer by trade and a quiet man by temperament, he lived a modest life in the foothills of Colorado. At 52, his days followed a rhythm he found comforting. Early mornings in the garage with coffee in hand, long hours solving mechanical puzzles at his workshop, and evenings filled with the joyful noise of family. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was faithful to his work, to his wife Emily, and to their two children, Noah, a wide-eyed 9-year-old full of questions, and Lily, a 2-year-old with a laugh that could melt granite. Life in Jonathan's eyes was not about chasing the extraordinary, but embracing the everyday, fixing a leaky faucet, building a wooden sled for Noah, watching Emily hum while folding laundry. He didn't need more than that. That Thanksgiving, like every year, they packed up their Subaru and made the 4-hour drive to Fort Collins to visit Emily's parents. The road was long, but familiar, winding through canyons and patches of snow-dusted pine. Emily sat in the passenger seat reading aloud from a children's book to keep Lily entertained, while Noah played with a small action figure in the back seat. The world outside was quiet, and clean white powder frosting the trees, the sky, the kind of blue you only see in late November. It felt, Jonathan would later recall, like a moment wrapped in peace. They had a wonderful visit filled with turkey, sweet potato casserole, old stories, and laughter that made the house feel full. On the morning of their departure, they bundled up the kids' strapped bags into the trunk and said their goodbyes. But then something small happened, small, but it would haunt Jonathan's memory for months. Emily, already buckled into the passenger seat, unclicked her seatbelt and ran back to the porch. Her parents were still waving from the doorway, but she wrapped them both in a second hug and kissed them, holding on a few seconds longer than usual. When she returned, Jonathan looked at her curiously. "We already said goodbye," he said with a puzzled smile. Emily shrugged, brushing a loose strand of the hair behind her ear. "I just wanted to thank them one more time," she said softly, her eyes distant, as if sensing something she couldn't quite name. Jonathan didn't think much of it at the time. He turned the key, the engine hummed to life, and they drove off into the late morning cold, unaware that everything would change before they ever reached home. But looking back, that simple gesture, her running back for one last embrace, would replay in his mind over and over like a whisper from eternity. There was something sacred in it, something unfinished. It was as though, on some level beyond reason, Emily had known. The sun was already dipping low behind the Rockies as Jonathan steered the car southbound on the I-25, heading home toward their quiet neighborhood in Castle Rock. Snow had started to fall again, light at first, like powdered sugar shaken across the windshield, but gradually thickening. The road, once dry and dependable, began to take on a deceptive sheen. Still, Jonathan kept both hands on the wheel, posture straight, eyes alert. Emily had drifted to sleep, her head tilted slightly toward the window, lips parted in a soft breath. In the back seat, Noah hummed to himself as he stared out the window, while little Lily clutched her stuffed bunny, already dreaming. They had just passed mile marker 182 when it happened. The curve ahead wasn't sharp, but the snow had settled into a slick glaze over the asphalt. A gust of wind swept across the highway like an invisible hand, and Jonathan felt the tires lose grip. The car began to fishtail, just slightly at first. He eased off the gas, trying to correct. But then the back wheels spun, and everything broke loose. The world turned sideways. The Subaru skidded across lanes. Jonathan's hands gripped the wheel with all his strength, but the steering meant nothing. Emily jolted awake and screamed his name. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of Noah's eyes, wide, terrified. Then the car spun once, twice, before slamming sideways into the steel guardrail. Metal crumpled. Glass exploded. The sound was deafening, like the sky itself tearing in half. And then silence. When Jonathan opened his eyes, he didn't recognize where he was. The car was on its side, twisted and smoking. Something heavy pinned his legs. His chest burned with every breath. He tried to move, but nothing obeyed. Cold air rushed in through the shattered windows. Blood trickled from somewhere above his temple. His vision blurred in and out like a failing signal. But then he heard it. "Noah." The voice was faint, broken. "Yes, Dad. Dad, I'm here," came the boy's sobbing reply from behind him. Relief and horror crashed together in his heart. His son was alive. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Jonathan turned his head slowly, painfully toward the passenger seat. Emily. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. Her face was turned gently toward the cracked window, still serene, just like she'd been while napping. And Lily. Oh God. The car seat behind Emily was shattered. The toddler's tiny frame had been crushed on impact. There was no sound, no movement, just the cold. "No, no, no, please." Jonathan gasped, his voice barely audible through the blood in his throat. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. Wanted to run to them, but his body was broken, mangled beneath twisted steel. The guilt hit like a tidal wave. It had been him behind the wheel. His hands had been in control. If only he had driven slower. If only he had taken the other route. If only. The words circled like vultures, tearing at the edges of his sanity. He closed his eyes, tears mixing with blood, and whispered, "God, please. If I could just go back. Just 5 seconds. I'd do anything." Time, however, offered no mercy. The distant wail of sirens began to rise, slow at first, then growing louder. Red and blue lights would soon bathe the wreckage. But in that suspended space between life and death, time felt still. Jonathan lay there, crushed in every way a man could be, physically, emotionally, spiritually, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't undo. Somewhere behind the pain, he remembered Emily's voice earlier that day. "I just wanted to thank them one more time." What had she known? Had her soul already glimpsed the end of the road? He wept until darkness took him. It wasn't the blackness of unconsciousness exactly. It was something else. A quiet place, weightless and strange. No pain, no noise, only stillness. And though he didn't know it yet, this was not the end. It was only the doorway. When the world went black, Jonathan Blake expected to stay there, in that last moment of agony, pinned beneath the wreckage of his own car. All he had left was sorrow, and a desperate prayer that he could trade his own breath for his daughter's, or rewind time by just a few precious seconds. But instead of sinking into the nothingness he feared, he found himself floating. Not metaphorically, literally. The pain disappeared, the pressure lifted, and he was suddenly weightless. At first he couldn't quite understand what was happening. There was no tunnel, no thunderous voice, no pearly gates. Just a soft, ambient light surrounding him, not coming from above or below, but from everywhere. The air, or whatever this was, carried no temperature. He wasn't hot or cold. He simply was. He looked down and gasped. Below him, the trauma room of the hospital came into focus like looking through a perfectly clean window. His own body was laid out on the table, surrounded by doctors in scrubs, moving quickly, purposefully. One shouted something about a crash cart. Another adjusted tubes near his chest. Someone else was performing CPR with rhythmic precision. Machines beeped urgently. Blood stained the sheets. And in the middle of it all was him. He didn't panic. Oddly, he didn't feel fear. There was a strange peace in observing the scene, even though it should have been terrifying. He hovered just beneath the ceiling, unseen, untouched, as if suspended in time. Then his awareness expanded, not just of his own body, but of everyone in the room. The tired nurse at his left had lost a patient earlier that morning and blamed herself. The younger surgeon near his feet was silently praying beneath his breath, even though he claimed to be an agnostic. The janitor passing by the hallway was grieving a son who had died the previous year. And in that moment, Jonathan knew all of this. Not in words, not through eavesdropping, but by feeling it. He couldn't explain how, but he felt every sorrow, every heartbeat, every hidden hope and ache of every person in that building. And not just them, everyone. The hospital became a sea of glowing threads, each life a story, each person connected in a vast, living tapestry. It was overwhelming but beautiful. He would later call this moment the oneness. There were no divisions here. No race, no religion, no politics. There was only love. Raw, unmistakable, unconditional love, the kind that didn't judge, didn't demand, didn't punish. It simply was, like air, like light, like God. Jonathan had never thought of himself as deeply spiritual. He believed in God in a quiet, respectful way, but rarely went to church, rarely prayed out loud. But here there was no question. This was something divine. And he was not alone. As his consciousness floated above the hospital bed, he began to move, not by walking, but by intention. The scene faded into light once more, and he was drawn forward into what felt like another realm. Not a physical place with landmarks, but a space of awareness, almost like the backdrop of a dream, only far more vivid than waking life. Memories played before him like living scenes, times when he had laughed with Noah in the backyard, moments when he had held Emily close in the early years of their marriage. Even small acts of kindness he had long forgotten, fixing an elderly neighbor's porch railing or encouraging a struggling coworker. Each moment pulsed with light and emotion. He didn't relive them. He re-experienced them through his heart, as if eternity had preserved every moment like a song, still playing somewhere in the distance. Then came the harder scenes. Arguments with Emily that ended in cold silence. Times when he let stress make him short with Noah. Even moments when he had walked past a stranger in need because he was too busy, too tired, too focused on himself. But there was no condemnation, no thunderbolt, no divine scolding. Instead, a gentle presence seemed to whisper, "What did you learn?" Jonathan didn't hear it with his ears, but with something deeper. The question wasn't asked in accusation, it was asked in love. As if this holy presence already knew everything, but wanted him to know it too. In that place beyond time and space, Jonathan Blake, engineer, husband, father, survivor, saw the blueprint of his life not as a list of accomplishments or failures, but as a journey of becoming. And as he stood in the heart of that mysterious, divine stillness, he felt something stirring on the horizon. He wasn't done yet. The sense of movement came again, gentle, like being carried by water, but not wet, not cold. Jonathan felt as though he were being drawn forward through a current of light, passing through what he could only describe as layers of memory and meaning. There were no walls, no floors yet, there was form. And then the light began to shift, softening into something warm and golden, almost like the late afternoon sun on a Colorado porch. The space around him deepened into clarity, and there, standing just a few feet away, was Emily. She was radiant, not in the poetic way people speak of beauty, but in a way that went beyond the physical. Her skin glowed with a kind of peace he'd never seen before. Her eyes sparkled with eternal understanding, as if she had seen the face of God and had brought a trace of it back with her. She wore a simple white dress that moved gently with a breeze that didn't touch him. And when she smiled, Jonathan wept. All the sorrow he had carried in his chest, the guilt, the loss, The agony of seeing her lifeless in that passenger seat rose to the surface like a flood breaking loose. He tried to speak, but couldn't. His throat tightened, words dissolved. He reached for her, desperate to hold her, to feel her once more. And she stepped forward. When her arms embraced him, it was unlike any embrace they'd ever shared on earth. There were no bones, no flesh, only presence. He felt her entire being, her memories, her love, her forgiveness, all woven into that one moment of contact. And suddenly the ache inside him cracked open, not just from grief, but from a realization she wasn't gone. Not really. "I've missed you so much," he managed to say, his voice shaking like a boy's. "I know," she whispered, her voice like music and memory blended into one. "But I've been with you." Jonathan tried to explain everything, the accident, the guilt, the unbearable silence in the house without her laugh. She touched his face gently and he fell silent. Her touch carried more than comfort. It carried knowing. She already knew. "You can't stay here, Jonathan," she said softly. His heart sank. "Please," he whispered. "Let me stay. I have nothing left there." She shook her head gently. "You still have Noah. He needs you more than you know." Jonathan closed his eyes, the thought of his son striking something deep inside him. He saw Noah's face, tear-streaked, confused, brave in a way no 9-year-old should ever have to be. He felt the boy's hand clinging to his own through the ambulance ride, the lonely nights he would face, the questions no one else could answer but him. "But I can't do it alone," Jonathan said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how." "You won't be alone," Emily said. "I'll still be with you. And so will he." Jonathan didn't have to ask who she meant. And then the space around them shifted again. Not violently, but with quiet majesty. Behind Emily, a corridor of light unfurled like a hallway made of sunbeams and breath. At the far end stood someone so radiant, so overwhelming that Jonathan instinctively lowered his eyes. He didn't see a face. He didn't need to. Every cell in his being knew. This was the presence that had watched his life unfold in silence. The same presence that had whispered, "What did you learn?" This was the one Emily had spoken of. The one she now stood beside with complete trust. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. He had never known such love, such holiness. It didn't burn. It embraced. It didn't judge it. Invited. He turned back to Emily, eyes wet with longing. "How do I let go again?" he asked. "You don't," she said with a tearless smile. "You carry me differently now." Jonathan stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her one last time. This time he felt not only love, but release. She didn't vanish. She faded like a sunset, not extinguished, but simply stepping into a new horizon. And then the light shifted again. Ahead of him, beyond the corridor, another scene began to form, one more intimate than all the rest. A small crib in a room filled with soft light. A familiar scent drifted toward him, lavender and baby powder, and there, curled up under a tiny quilt, lay Lily, breathing, peaceful, as if she had only been asleep. Jonathan didn't walk toward the crib. He didn't have to. It was as though his spirit simply moved with intention, with love. He drew closer, and the soft scene before him shimmered with a kind of beauty he didn't know existed. The room wasn't the nursery from their home, but it felt like it. There were no sharp lines, only warmth, only comfort. The quilt was one Emily had sewn by hand, the same one Lily used to drag around the house like a cape, and there she was, his daughter. Her cheeks were round and rosy, Her lips parted slightly as she breathed in and out. Her tiny chest rose with every gentle breath. The stuffed bunny she never slept without was nestled beneath one arm. She looked perfect, alive, whole. Jonathan knelt beside the crib, hands trembling as he reached down and lifted her. She felt light and real, like flesh, not a vision, not a memory, but her. Her hair still held the faint scent of baby shampoo and sunshine. He kissed her forehead and held her close, burying his face into the crook of her neck. It was all too much, too sacred, too pure. And for the first time since the accident, he didn't feel broken. He felt home. Time did not exist here, and yet every second with her felt eternal. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her breath, her warmth, her presence said everything. And Jonathan wept, not the bitter tears of grief, but the soft tears of reunion, of something lost being found. But then came the change. He sensed it first, not as a sound, but as a shift in the air, like the moment right before a storm, or the hush just before dawn. Something greater was drawing near. A presence approached, not loud, not boastful, but unmistakable. Jonathan turned. Behind him stood a figure not defined by features or form, but by essence. Radiant, gentle, eternal. He could not see a face, but he felt the eyes that had seen the beginning and end of time and yet looked upon him with the tenderness of a father. It was the same presence from before. The one Emily had spoken of. The one whose love had wrapped around him in the life review. There was no fear, only reverence. Jonathan clutched Lily closer, suddenly protective. "Please," he whispered, not fully knowing what he was asking. "Please don't take her again." And then the voice spoke, not aloud, but within him. A voice made not of sound, but of knowing. "You were never separated. You only thought you were." Jonathan's breath caught. He looked down at Lily, sleeping so peacefully in his arms. The guilt bubbled up again, uninvited. The what-ifs. The regret, the cruel question that had haunted him since the crash. Was it my fault? He couldn't hold it back anymore. "How can you forgive me?" he asked through tears. "I was driving. I failed. I let them die." The presence responded not with accusation, not with blame, but with a wave of love so deep it almost broke him. "There is nothing to forgive. Everything has been known from the beginning. Every tear, every choice, every heartbeat. You are not being punished. You are being shaped." Jonathan's knees buckled as he sank to the ground, Lily still in his arms. The weight of it, the mercy, the freedom washed over him like warm rain. All the things he had feared, all the shame he had carried melted away in that moment of divine clarity. He understood then this was not a courtroom. This was not a test. This was healing. Then came the most intimate moment of all. The presence gently asked, "Do you want to keep her?" Jonathan looked up, startled. "You may stay." The voice continued. "You may hold her forever in this place of peace, or you may trust me and give her back, not as a loss, but as an offering of love." His heart fractured again. Stay here with Lily, with peace, with no more pain, or return to the world of aching bones and empty beds. The world where Emily's laughter no longer echoed down the hall. He looked at Lily. Her eyes were still closed. Her fingers curled slightly around the collar of his shirt. She didn't resist. She trusted. And in that moment, so did he. With every trembling fiber of his soul, Jonathan pressed a kiss to her forehead, whispered a prayer he couldn't form into words, and lifted her upward, not into the air, but into the light. The presence received her. She did not vanish. She became light, joined with it, woven into it. And somehow Jonathan knew she was not gone. She had never truly been gone. He had carried her in grief. Now he would carry her in love. And with that, the world began to shift again. The warmth receded. The presence grew more distant. And Jonathan felt the pull, gentle but certain, drawing him back to the weight of gravity, of pain, of life. As the light gently dimmed and the world of spirit began to give way, Jonathan felt a strange stillness come over him. Not the stillness of death, but of waiting. He was no longer holding Lily, yet he still felt her heartbeat inside him. He was no longer standing before the divine presence, yet the presence had not left. It was as if he had been brought to the threshold of a great mystery, and now he stood on the edge of choice. It was then he heard the voice again, not in thunder, not in wind, but like a whisper carved into the very core of his being. "You are free." 3 words, simple, gentle, yet they echoed through him like bells tolling over a silent valley. In that moment, Jonathan realized something he had never fully grasped, even after years of quietly believing in God. He had never understood the depth of free will. He had assumed life was a script, something to follow, or perhaps a punishment to endure. But now he saw that it was neither. It was a partnership. The voice continued, not with demands, not with guilt, but with an invitation. "You may stay, or you may return. The choice is yours. But know this, if you go back, you will not return empty-handed." Jonathan's spirit stirred. "Return," he whispered. "You have seen with new eyes. Now you must walk in that vision, not to fix everything, not to carry guilt, but to love freely, fully, fearlessly." He thought of Noah, his son's freckled face, his questions, his tears, the way he used to look up at him like a hero. Jonathan had once feared he could never be enough for that boy, not after the accident. But now, he saw differently. He saw that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. Then the voice said something he would carry with him for the rest of his days. "You keep asking how I can forgive you. But child, there is nothing to forgive. You think you failed. But I never asked you to be perfect. I asked you to be real, to learn, to love, to trust. Everything you lost was never lost. Everything you regret, I already knew. And I still chose you." Jonathan broke, not in despair but in release. He sobbed not for what he had done but for what he had misunderstood. He had spent so much time believing that God was waiting to punish him, to condemn him for the crash, for the pain, for the things he couldn't undo. But here in this timeless place of clarity he saw the truth. God hadn't been waiting to punish him. God had been waiting to hold him. The life review he had seen earlier, the moments of joy, the moments of failure, it wasn't about tallying sin. It was about illuminating love. What had he done with the love he was given? How had he carried it, spent it, multiplied it, or ignored it? And now, another question rose in his heart, not from guilt, but from awe. What will I do with it now? Because in that moment, he knew he could not stay. As tempting as it was to remain where pain could not touch him, where Emily and Lily waited in eternal peace, he knew he was still needed. Not as a perfect father, not as a spiritual giant, but as a man who had walked through fire and come out changed. A man who could look another broken heart in the eyes and say, "There is more. There is hope. There is healing." The light pulsed softly around him and the voice spoke once more. "You are not returning to punishment. You are returning to purpose." And as Jonathan began to feel the pull of gravity again, the weight of his broken body, the ache of a hospital bed, he asked one final question from the deepest place in his heart. "Will you go with me?" And the answer came not in words, but in presence. Always. When Jonathan opened his eyes, the sterile lights of the ICU greeted him. Pain lanced through his body. Machines beeped. Tubes ran from his arms. But something was different. His soul was no longer shattered. It had been stitched together in a sacred place, thread, by hands he had never seen but now trusted completely. And as the tears slipped down his cheeks, not from agony, but from awe, he whispered, "Thank you. For the crash. For the healing. For the choice. For the mercy. And above all, for the freedom to love again." The first breath back in his body felt like fire, thick, raw, unnatural. Jonathan gasped his lungs, screaming for air, as if they had been underwater too long. His eyes blinked open slowly to a world of white light and quiet beeping. He was in a hospital bed surrounded by machines, tubes, and the faint scent of antiseptic. Pain laced through every part of him, his chest, his legs, even his jaw. But beneath it all was something stronger than pain. Awareness. He was back. Not because he had to be, because he had chosen to be. It took days before he could speak more than a whisper, weeks before he could sit up without assistance, and months before he could walk again. Part of his leg had been crushed beyond repair, and was later amputated below the knee. The road to recovery was steep, and filled with silent battles, phantom pain, long nights of physical therapy, the maddening stillness of grief, but the weight that had once made him want to die. The guilt, the despair, the torment of what if no longer held the same power. He still missed Emily and Lily with every fiber of his being. He still cried when no one was watching. But the voice, he'd heard the voice of love, that had met him in the mystery, continued to echo through the corridors of his mind. You are not returning to punishment. You are returning to purpose. And that purpose had a name. Noah. Jonathan's first clear memory in the hospital wasn't the surgeons or the nurses or even the pastor who came to pray. It was Noah sitting quietly beside him, holding his hand with both of his own. The boy didn't speak. He didn't have to. His face was puffy from crying, but his grip was firm. Stronger than a child should have been. That touch carried something sacred, something unspoken. You came back for me. From that moment on, Jonathan knew he would learn to walk again. Not just for himself, but for the little boy who had lost his mother and sister in a blink, but still believed in miracles. They grieved together, father and son. There were nights Noah would crawl into Jonathan's hospital bed crying until sleep took him. Jonathan would hold him close, whispering words he hoped were enough. He didn't have all the answers, but he had presence. And now he understood that was what mattered most. After several months of intense rehabilitation, Jonathan returned home. The house felt different, quieter, lonelier, but still alive. Lily's crib was no longer there. Emily's coat still hung by the door. But something deeper had changed within him. He had seen behind the veil. He had kissed his daughter goodbye in the arms of the divine. He had embraced his wife in a place where time could not touch them. And now he walked the earth again with a heart that had been rebuilt, not stronger, but softer. 1 year after the accident, Jonathan found himself at a support group for single parents, mostly to help Noah, he told himself. He hadn't expected to talk much, let alone connect with anyone. But that's when he met Sarah. She was kind. Not in a flashy, over-polished way, but in the way that made you feel seen. She had lost her husband to cancer, and she too was raising a child on her own. They talked. Then they talked again. Then they started sitting next to each other. Then came coffee, long walks, shared meals, and finally feelings. Jonathan wrestled with guilt. He would sit on the back porch at night looking at the stars, asking questions that still lingered. Am I betraying Emily? Is it too soon? What if I'm just trying to fill a hole that can't be filled? But on one such night as the wind gently stirred the wind chimes, Emily had once hung outside their bedroom window. He felt her presence again, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as peace. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a sense, a gentle permission, a sacred nod. You can love again. I'm not leaving, I'm just cheering you on from another room. And that was the moment Jonathan chose not to move on, but to move forward. Because love, he had learned, never dies. It just changes form. The months that followed were not free of hardship, but they were full of meaning. Jonathan Blake, now a widowed single father with a prosthetic leg and a heart that had been shattered and stitched back together by divine hands, was no longer the same man who once took life for granted. Grief had stripped him to the bone, but grace had rebuilt him from the inside out. The house in Castle Rock no longer echoed with Lily's giggles or Emily's humming in the kitchen, but it was not empty. It held stories now. Every wall, every photo frame, every drawer Emily had once organized felt like a sacred relic. Jonathan didn't try to erase the past. He didn't cover it up or pack it away in boxes. He honored it. Lily's favorite stuffed bunny remained on the shelf. Emily's journal stayed by the bedside pages worn from years of love notes, thoughts, and prayers. He read them slowly, reverently, like scripture from a life once shared. Noah, now 10, had changed too. He wasn't just a boy who had lost his mother and sister. He had become a quiet warrior. He still had nightmares, still asked the hard questions at bedtime. Do you think Mommy misses us? Why did Lily have to go? Jonathan never pretended to have all the answers, but he offered what he did have: truth, wrapped in tenderness. She's not gone forever, he'd say. She's just ahead of us. They talked more now about God, about death, about what it means to live with your heart wide open, even when it hurts. And strangely, the pain began to weave itself into a deeper kind of joy. A joy that didn't ignore the scars, but embraced them. Jonathan threw himself into his healing, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Physical therapy was grueling. He had to relearn how to balance, how to walk, how to climb the stairs again. But each small victory was a testament. With every step he carried the memories of his family and the quiet resolve of a man who had stood on the edge of eternity and chosen to return. He also began journaling, something he'd never done before. At first, it was just to process his thoughts, but eventually it became a mission. He began to write down his entire experience, every sacred moment, every vision, every word from that voice of love. Not to publish, not to preach, but to remember. Then one Sunday morning, nearly a year after the crash, the pastor at his church invited him to speak. Jonathan had never liked public speaking, but something inside nudged him forward. So standing behind the pulpit with his son in the front row and his heart thudding like a drum, he told his story. Not the polished version, the real one. He spoke of grief, of guilt, of divine mercy, of meeting Emily again, of holding Lily, of being asked to choose Boba. And he told them what he had learned in that quiet place beyond time. Life is not a test. It's a gift. We're not here to be perfect. We're here to love. And love doesn't die. It just changes where it lives. Afterward, people lined up just to touch his hand, to whisper their own stories of loss, to say thank you. I needed to hear that. And something changed again. Jonathan realized that his survival wasn't just for Noah. It was for others too, for the woman 2 rows behind who had buried a husband, for the man who still hadn't forgiven himself for an accident decades ago. He had become, without ever planning it, a messenger. A year after that, he married Sarah. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just a small gathering under the golden cottonwoods behind the church. Noah stood proudly at his side, holding the ring. Sarah wore a simple dress and held his hand tightly as they exchanged vows, not to forget, but to begin again. They never replaced Emily or Lily. No one could. But they didn't have to. Love, Jonathan had learned, isn't bound to one lifetime. It expands. It includes. Today, Jonathan shares his story wherever he's asked: churches, grief groups, even podcasts. Not as a preacher, not as a guru, but as a man who was broken and lived to tell the tale. And when he looks into the eyes of someone aching with loss, he doesn't offer cliches. He offers the truth. You're not alone. You've never been alone. And the story's not over yet. Jonathan Blake never returned to the man he was before the crash, and that was the point. Pain had broken him, but love had rebuilt him. Not into a copy of who he had been, but into someone deeper, truer. A man who walked not only with a prosthetic leg, but with a soul that had stood in eternity and come back, humbled, healed, and changed. He didn't start a ministry. He didn't write a best-selling book. He didn't stand on stages or go viral. What he did was more powerful. He lived. He raised his son with presence. He married again with courage. He cried when the wind smelled like Emily's perfume, or when Lily's favorite song played unexpectedly on the radio. And then he smiled, not because the pain had gone, but because love was still present. He tended a garden in the backyard and taught Noah how to drive. He showed up for people in their pain. He whispered hope into hospital rooms and funeral homes. His porch became a soft place for neighbors to sit and breathe. And sometimes on clear Colorado nights he'd sit outside and look up at the stars, hand in Sarah's, Noah asleep upstairs, and he'd remember the light. Not just the blinding glory of the divine, but the smaller lights too. The ones we miss: a baby's breath, a final kiss on a porch, a whisper in a hospital bed. He learned that heaven isn't only a place we go. Sometimes heaven is the space we create when we choose to love again. And if you were to ask him now what it all meant, why it had to hurt so much, he'd pause, his eyes misting with a wisdom that only comes from walking through fire, and say, "This life isn't about holding on. It's about letting go with love. Love never dies. It just waits. And no matter how dark it gets, there is always a light willing to lead you home."